Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly. With me today is Adam Gopnik. Adam has been writing for The New Yorker since 1986. He's a three-time winner of the National Magazine Award for Essays and Criticism. From 1995 to the year 2000, he lived in Paris. He now lives in New York City with his family. His many books include Paris to the Moon, A Family in France, Through the Children's Grate, A Home in New York, and 1,000 Small Sanities, The Moral Adventure of Liberalism, all of which are essential reading for our work on the future of democracy and our festival of the future city. His new book is The Real Work, On the Mystery of Mastery, which we're talking about today. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining us.
It's wonderful to be with you, Andrew.
Before we start on the book, I saw you most recently actually in Tar. What was it like to play effectively yourself in an event which resembled the New Yorker festival and with Kate Blanchett?
I will never live down this appearance in Tar. It was 24 hours in Berlin and 25 years of life after. The asymmetry between the notoriety of a writer and the notoriety of a film appearance is enormous. It was fantastic. You know, I accepted when Todd Field approached me about it, I said, no, it's not the kind of thing I do. It'll look pitiful and attention seeking, which doubtless it still does. But then, Todd was, like all great directors, a good seducer. And he said to me, oh, such a shame, because we would love to bring you and your wife to Berlin for 10 days in a wonderful hotel. And Kate Blanchett will be so disappointed that she can't perform with someone as charismatic and enlivening as you are, and we'll have to have an actor in set. So I said, hold on, let me call Mr. Gopnik to the phone, and agreed to do it at that point. And it was wonderful. She's an astounding, as you can imagine. It speaks directly to the subject matter of my new book. I'm fascinated by mastery and by high accomplishment and performance, especially. And my goodness, you couldn't imagine someone more accomplished to work with than Kate Blanchett. And the thing that was astounding to me about working with her, Andrew, for the 2 days that we worked, was her professionalism, which I know sounds like a kind of minimal thing to praise someone for. They were very professional. But if you think about it, it's actually kind of maximal praise, because what it means is every single moment was considered in advance. There was improvisation as we played with each other, and a few of the lines we made up as we went. But basically, she had thought through every moment, understood where the psychological pressure was, what the psychological pressure on me ought to be, where she had to disappear, where she had to be aggressive. It was astounding to work with her. And it was like, I'm not a tennis player, but I imagine it was like playing tennis with a great player, where you're constantly, wherever you put the ball over the net, they return it. So it was a wonderful experience. And Kate and I then did an post interview for the New Yorker, where we talked about having done that together. And as she said, this was truly, meta paradise in doing it. The only thing I'd add to it too, Andrew, is that I was playing myself, but I was playing a very stylized version of myself, which is the self that I often play on stage. I'm very often in your seat in these exchanges, right? Having a conversation with Stephen Sondheim or James Taylor or E.O. Wilson or someone, and trying exactly to draw them out in some natural and warm way so that they'll talk more freely than they might otherwise. But that's very much a role I play. And I was having to play that role I play on a soundstage in Berlin while still trying to play myself with Kate Blanchett. So I was playing myself. And as I said someplace, it put me immediately in mind of that beautiful line in Penny Lane, the matchless Beatles song. Though she feels as if she's in a play, she is anyway. That's where I was.
When you mentioned tennis, I could see a Gopnik appearance at Wimbledon maybe one day anyway. It's a terrific film. I think I loved watching it, and I thought it I've been telling everyone they must see it. Well, let's talk about mastery, and there's a number of important distinctions you make in the book, and I just wanted to put these to you, and then we move on to some of the examples. So the first is between achievement and accomplishment. Just talk us through that.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. That's exactly, that for me is the foundational distinction. And it's one that came to me as I watched my kids coming of age, right? Going from childhood and into adolescence. And I was stunned and worried because the American system, and I suspect it's true of the British system, it's certainly true of the French system, is one that's driven towards what I think of as achievement rather than accomplishment. What do I mean by that? What's the difference? Well, achievement is about being the rat successfully running the maze. It's about mastering the test, getting into the next good school, the next university, the next program, and so on. And it's a form of driven performance. It's all about achievement, and the achievements themselves can be very abstract or of dubious internal value. Accomplishment for me is the mastery of a task or the mastery of a craft. I think of it in my own history. I remember when it's like everyone in my generation talking of the Beatles, I got a big book of Beatle chords and a folk guitar that I had never played, and I struggled to make a C chord and an E minor chord and an F chord, and it took me weeks of physical pain to do it. But the sense of satisfaction when you heard Beatle harmonies at your fingers, in your hands. And everything I've done in life, in a very real sense, is built on that platform of accomplishment. I can do this difficult thing. No matter how difficult this thing is, I can do it. And I saw that with my own kids. My son, Luke, who's very much a character in the book, flitting in and out, has the best line in the book, got obsessed with card magic when he was 12 or 13. And the school he was going to, a very New York, progressive, but highly competitive school, were not crazy about the idea of his spending all his time doing the Erdnase color change. And at first I was concerned, and then I was, no, what he's learning by mastering something like that is more valuable than doing well on the calculus test or getting an A, as we say here, rather than a C in Spanish. And he actually at one point went off to be the personal assistant of David Blaine, the great escape artist and Houdini of our time. And I intuitively felt that's going to be more valuable to him. And I think I was right. He's since gone on not to be a magician and not to be a musician, which he tried out afterwards, but to be a philosopher. He's finishing his doctorate in philosophy. And he will say that, everything he feels about the possibilities of mastering that terribly technical and demandingly rigorous logic and art of academic philosophy rests on his ability to force a card on you when he was 12. And I think that the more we fill our kids' lives with accomplishment and a sense of accomplishment, we all know it in our own lives. It was the thing we mastered, the ball we hit successfully, the goal we scored in soccer when they said we couldn't. We'll never be professional football players. We'll never be professional musicians. But that series of accomplishments, I think, is far more significant, far more consequential for our subsequent lives than any number of enforced achievements.
And it's the things you remember, isn't it? I mean, that you're in. I remember when you said scoring a goal there. I remember when I used to play on the student staff football team at university, and I scored once the most beautiful goal. I would never actually achieve that or accomplish that again. But I remember that it was a left-footed goal, and I'm not left-footed, but it was a brilliant kick, and it went right into the net. And I was so proud of that moment, I tell you. It was.
I had exactly a parallel moment. We were living in London when I was 15 or so, and for a year, and I played football with my mates every Sunday in Kensington Gardens, right, is a great tradition. And I was an American who had never had a ball at his feet before, and I finally scored that goal, and it still rings and reverberates within my body, because it's something we know was good, and even the people who don't like us can't say that wasn't good, because it was.
Yeah, even your opponents were admire what you'd achieved, I think. So
only in London terms, in America you'd high five, and in London you said, nicely done, nicely done.
One of the things, there are many things. I mean, the other distinction I just wanted to get you to talk through is about rote work versus real work, and just tell us about that.
It's a kind of subsidiary, pendant distinction of the difference between achievement and accomplishment, as I imagine it for this book. Rote work is all the work that kids, particularly, but all of us are assigned to do. It's learning calculus, learning Spanish, all of which are obviously worthy and things. But then the real work is the work. It's a phrase that I learned from magicians. When Luke became obsessed with magic, one of the joys of having kids is that they lead us into their worlds as much as we've led them into ours. And he got very good, and he got involved with the world of magicians. In fact, there was a bar on 9th Avenue in New York, which is a rather seedy avenue, called Joshua Tree. And and where all the magicians hung out after the magic shows. And that's the only place on earth he wanted to be. And at 13, when it was time for his bar mitzvah, we're a very secularized family. I said, what do you want to do for your 13th birthday? He said, just like to have a party with the magicians at the Joshua Tree. So we have, he's been in a beautiful suit, 13, in the back of the bar in the Joshua Tree. And that's a term magicians love, the real work. And they mean by that, who's got the mastery of this? Not who invented the trick, not who first attempted the illusion, not even who does it in the slickest and most telegenic way. They mean who's really got it, who really understands how to make this thing work, not just to say the woman disappears, but to genuinely shock you with the disappearing woman. And I love that phrase because they use it as a shorthand. Who's got the real work on that? Yeah. And in all of our work, we know what the rote work is. We know when people are doing work by rote. But when somebody's got the real work, my goodness, we know it in an instant in all of our fields. One of the things I've found as a reporter on the other side of these exchanges in life is that no matter who you're speaking to, right? You're talking to a plumber, you're talking to a fireman, you're talking to an art historian, and you say to them in American terms, who's the Willie Mays of firemen? Who's the Willie Mays of plumbing? Willie Mays being the most spectacularly gifted, the George Best of plumbing. Everyone has an answer. Nobody ever says, oh, we don't have that. Nobody in our field is that extraordinary. Everybody answers. Pastry chefs, right? They tell you, oh, Max Poilâne is even better than his brother Lionel. They say oh my God, Ferran Adria's brother, Albert, he's the god of these things. So we all know the real work. We all know that quality of easy, unforced, natural mastery when we encounter it in life, and we love it, we admire it. And that's very much for me what the real work is, and exactly what I wanted to study, to approach, to observe in this book.
Now the book reports, you write about all the things you did do, or some of the things you did do, and you intersperse it with some of the mysteries of mastery. And we'll perhaps just go through a few of these now. You start with this wonderful story, actually, of the mechanical Turk. And you say in there, in that section, we overrate masters and underrate mastery. Tell us about that.
Well, the Turk fascinated me. It's not to take too long to explain it, but it was essentially an automaton, the late 18th century, that could play chess. And people were astounded because it won at chess again and again with chess masters, and with played Napoleon, Ben Franklin, and so on. And to make a long story short, everyone was convinced it was, an early computer. It was a robot, chess-playing robot. And of course it wasn't. It was a magician's illusion with a cunningly concealed lower cabinet where a chess player could be hidden and could then operate you call the Turk, because he was dressed as an Ottoman, operate his fingers and hands and make the moves. What fascinated me is a very good book by Tom Standage about it. But what even Standage in this terrific book didn't really note sufficiently, I thought, was everyone speculated who could be inside this machine playing as the Turk. It must be a small midget genius, or it must be a child who's been trained to do it. And the answer was that the operators of the Turk simply went to the chess cafe in every city they were going to, not even in advance, and said basically, who needs work and doesn't mind cramped working conditions? And they would get someone for, the equivalent of $1,000 to come and play inside the Turk. The genius of von Kempelen, the man who invented the Turk, was to see mastery is incredibly widespread in a modern society. There are more good chess players than we can possibly imagine. Finding a great chess player is not that hard to do, and slipping him inside, once you slip him inside the machine, he becomes even better because the atmospherics of the machine enable him to have a kind of aura that he wouldn't have if you could look at him and say, oh, I know this guy, this is Francois, he's an A-, as we would say, chess player. And so that idea that mastery is incredibly widespread in a modern society, I associate with the inventors of the Turk. But it's a broader truth, right? We all know, if you love classical music, you know that the number of amazing violin players, of viola players, is just astounding. There's nothing more competitive than the competition for a seat in an orchestra. And that raises another interesting question. Since mastery is so widespread, so extraordinary? What is it that we respond to when we say this woman is the greatest viola player on the planet? What is it we respond to when there's that, is what I call the Willie Mays phenomenon, right? Who's the greatest viola player? Oh, that's an easy answer, right? There are thousands of good viola players. There's only one viola, right? And the answer almost invariably, Andrew, is that there's some personal signature, some literally often vibrato, legato, a style of interpretation. I was listening to the great Japanese and British pianist Michiko Uchida the other day, and her greatness all lies in her incredible gift for delicately italicizing passages. She's a fantastic technical pianist, but there are 1,000 fantastic technical pianists. So that quality of idiosyncratic vibration is what I think we associate with the masters above the masters, with that handful of people, whether they're writers or musicians or football players, who have that special capacity.
Now, when you set out to explore some of these areas, it's incredibly hard work, isn't it? I mean, you take trying to paint, for example, and draw. You know, you spent a year at that, didn't you? And I think, you know, I don't know, you probably know that book, part of the book was extracted in our Observer newspaper.
Observer, yeah.
This weekend. And I don't know whether you've had chance, but I checked all the below the line comments on the extract. And there's some wonderful stories there about how inspirational your work is, what they've done in their lives and so on. I was quite moved in a way by some of those comments. But when you tried to learn to draw, what was that about? You've been an art critic for a long time, but
yes,
you've never painted, for example.
Or drawn. Well, first of all, it's funny you say that, because I know I should be more kind of hyper dignified Samuel Beckett-like figure and saying, oh, I never look at comments on my work. But in fact, I did. In fact, I did. Exactly. I didn't read the extract because I knew it, but I was fascinated to see how would ordinary readers react. And I was touched and encouraged that pretty much everyone said, oh, this is great because I have a story. I mastered macrame at 90, or I began for the first time cake baking, a popular one, and so on too. And so I was enormously pleased that it was vibrating in that way. The thing about drawing, and I should add right away, Andrew, that in this book, there was no pre-plan to this book. It wasn't that I set out to say, I'm going to do all of these stunts to do it. It all happened quite organically. I met a great drawing teacher, and I thought, teach me to draw. You know, it was an instinctive thing, you know, like in The Little Prince, when he says, you know, if you please draw me a sheep. I said, teach me to draw a sheep. And what was fascinating about that interchange is two parts. One, it was a bit compensatory because I had been an art critic, in fact, an art historian. I'm 37 years late turning in my doctoral dissertation, but had done all the rest of graduate school. And I never knew how to draw. Now, you can make a perfectly legitimate case that it isn't essential. We can be good judges without being expert performers. The best sports writers are not necessarily, in fact, very improbably, the best sportsmen. But I do feel now, and it's a sort of, maybe it's the onset of middle age that makes me feel it. I feel a sort of compensatory regret. We can't really understand what it is to be Matisse or Michelangelo if we don't understand what it feels like to hold that pencil in your hand and attempt to register something from the real world, whether you do it hyper-naturalistically or you do it with a modern sense of freedom and expressive individuality. So I set myself to study with the most reactionary, hard-ass, old-fashioned drawing instructor in New York, wonderful man, still a dear friend named Jacob Collins, who basically believed that all art had gone wrong in 1855, who hated the kind of modernism that I was writing my PhD thesis about, that I'd been writing about as an art critic for almost 40 years. And Jacob put me to work in this beautifully old-fashioned kind of pocket in time where there were still plaster casts of antique statues and obviously nude people coming in and out, to learn the hard art of classical drawing, classical life drawing. And it took me a year. I never got any good at it. When these are investigations, explorations of the mystery of mastery. They're not any claim to have mastered these things. But I learned so much from Jacob. And in part, not that it changed my taste, but it made me re-articulate my taste. Why do I love Matisse? It's not just a learned response, but it's an understanding of exactly the way that Matisse himself re-articulated the classical tradition of drawing. But one of the things that fascinated me about working with Jacob is, you think before you start drawing, you think that, well, I'll look at Andrew and I'll just start capturing whatever there is in Andrew, and that's a total failure. There's no kind of epiphany, no hand on your shoulder that descends to guide your fingers as you draw. Instead, Jacob taught me a set of skills, which often seem quite remote from the task of drawing. The one I talk about in the book a lot is tilts in time. When he could see how I was struggling, he said, don't worry about drawing Andrew. He said, just figure out, where is Andrew's nose in relation to his chin on the face of a clock? Is it 5 minutes past 2? Is it 2 minutes past 2? Is it 25 minutes past 2? Just draw a clock and think about where that line falls in the clock. And of course, once you start doing that, you're making tilts in time. It's simple. Anybody, even I, could do that. But it's beginning to teach you a system and a set of schemata, if you like, of tools. And one of the things that all of the learning that I've done in life, but for the purposes of this book, all have in common, Andrew, is that they all involve steps, specific stumbling steps that you learn with difficulty, that almost magically, if you persevere with them, if you stick to them, then turn into a sequence. The steps become a sequence, and that sequence is what we call the flow, the feeling of mastery. But it always all begins with breaking down the task into a series of very often awkward, seemingly remote steps. That's how we learn to dance, how we learn to box, it's how we learn to draw. And I felt that so strongly with Jacob doing this very resistant thing, and I never got good at it. But I got to the point where I knew what I was missing in not being good, when those steps were beginning to become a sequence for me.
I mean, that comes through every task you describe in the book, the step-by-step approach you make comes through each time. In terms of the flow, what kind of emotions do you feel when you write, when you're in that process?
Well, one of the, you mentioned, right, the book is divided between these chapters on these essays, comic, I hope, in feeling, not comic comedy, but comic in the sense that the discrepancy between my ambitions and my accomplishments are always real. But then there are these chapters on the mysteries of mastery. And one of them that was very important for me was the one on the hummingbird's heartbeat, because that's, one of the things that we're often told as folk knowledge is that hummingbirds and elephants have exactly the same number of heartbeats in a lifetime. They just experience them differently. And astonishingly, Andrew, that turns out to be true. I actually found the Heartbeat Project at North Carolina State University, and they study this, and more or less, grosso modo, that's true. The sense of interiority. So we think, well, the hummingbird doesn't know its life is shorter than the elephant's because the hummingbird is the same existential reach, is counting the same number of heartbeats. And I think that's very true. When we feel the flow, no matter how inadequately by external standards it might be, we feel it inside as an almost a thrilling sense of satisfaction. And we recognize it. We're drawing in a way we couldn't. We're driving, another thing that was a huge hurdle for me, and we're actually driving up Madison Avenue, and we're not killing anybody, and we're actually stopping when we should stop and advancing when we should advance. This is tied totally, I think, Andrew, to the distinction between accomplishment and achievement that we began by talking about, right? What accomplishment gives you is exactly that, the internal poise of the flow, knowing what that feels like. And so the mystery of interiority, the mystery of the hummingbird's heartbeats, is a very important one in the book, because what it says is it's not how many times your heart beats out in the external elephant world. It's how many times your heart beats, how you enter the flow in the internal, if you like, metaphorically, hummingbird world.
I mean, I learned so much from your book, Adam. One of the most remarkable things was the Heartbeat Project, to be honest, and how they encourage people to measure heartbeats in various different animals and birds and so on. I mean, it was quite a remarkable project, really.
Yes, I was delighted. I stumbled on it, and I was delighted to. That's one of the joys of trying to do kind of horizontal thinking is that you find those things and you're astounded that you think, has anyone counted them? You say, someone has. Another example, if I might add, of how mastery is very widely disseminated. You'd think it was an unanswerable question. Not a bit. There are scientists who are answering it.
Now, you mentioned there, you're one of the other things you did was about learning to drive. Learning to drive when older, but also learning to drive in New York. This was a remarkable accomplishment, I think.
Yes, I believe, and perhaps someone will controvert me, but that my son Luke was 20, I was about 55, and we took our driving tests on the same, not just on the same day, but in sequence with the same driving inspector. I did it first, he did, and we both got our licenses at the same time, separated by 35 years. I don't know if that's ever happened before. But I had never learned to drive, in part because I live in New York City and have since I was 20 years old, and no one has a car in New York except a couple of Canadians. And you don't need one, it's too expensive and so on. But also there was a certain stopper inside of me. One of the things I tried to do in this book, Andrew, is that every accomplishment that I undertook invariably turned out to have a subtext of personal engagement. So learning to bake with my mother was about my relationship with my mother. And learning to drive, I realized as I was doing it, was very much about my relationship with my father. My father is a hyper competent person who has been driving since he was 14, for whom driving, as for so many men of his generation, was a sign of autonomy, had 6 kids who he chauffeured everywhere, and then 18 grandchildren, truly, who he then chauffeured everywhere. And I had never learned to drive, in part because we all make ourselves in the shadow of our father's accomplishments and in the sunlight of what they have an accomplishment. My dad is a super competent person. I tried to become a super performing person of a kind. So I recognized that I had to sort of put my father inside my body in order to learn to drive. And becoming my father was part of learning to drive. And also, I'd spent my life in the right-hand front seat. I guess in Britain, it would be the left-hand front seat, which is traditionally the woman's seat. And I was the one who passed out cookies over my shoulder to the kids. And I was going, shh, your mother's trying to find the exit. Come on, everybody, quiet now while your mom finds the exit. And I was happy in that seat, but I wanted to find out what it felt like in the seat beside. So all of those things were part of learning to drive. And I think, if I may moralize for a moment, one of the lessons of the book and one of the lessons of my experiences was that we are wholly ourselves in everything we do. We can't ever narrow a skill, an accomplishment, an area of mastery into the technical thing itself. It invariably implicates our parents, our children, our friends, our past, our ethnic heritage, and as I talk about in the chapter on boxing, where I got fascinated by Jewish boxers and everything else we do.
I mean, one of the things, when I learned to drive, I did feel this immense sense of accomplishment because, I was terrified when I started, as I think a lot of people are. And I remember the first time the driving instructor said, you can drive on your own now. And, my hands were shaking.
Sheer terror.
Absolute terror. And I was probably going about 3 miles an hour or something like that, But there was one... Sorry. Yeah.
I was doing it, as you say, in New York City, right? So I'm alone there. I'm like a frozen man just moving this thing. And there are taxis coming by you at 80 miles per hour, guys who, arrived in America 3 days before, right? And are in a 16-wheel trucks bearing down on you. Nobody has the least concern for anybody else's well-being. And it's one of the funny things about driving in our society, right, is that driving turns out to not to be terribly difficult, but it's insanely dangerous, right? You've got 2 tons of speeding metal that you're controlling. It's sort of salubrious, sort of encouraging, right, that we don't have more disasters than we do. Driving is plenty damn dangerous as it is, but it's also a beautiful picture of, what self-emerging societies, right? On the whole, most people stop at the red light. Most people look both ways in the car before they turn. It's a very powerful symbol of how modern societies cooperate and how they conflict.
When I described earlier on the feeling when I scored that fantastic goal, I was the George Best of my time for a moment. When I was learning to drive, there was one, I was very bad I was a very bad pupil, I must say, but finally it all came together. And there was one moment when I got up to a junction, made sure I could stop, looked left and right, went, indicated properly, and even the driving instructor said that was nice, and it was that kind of sense of accomplishment really
fills your chest with that sense of the flow. I've published 1 million words in the New Yorker, 11 books and so on, and that's my vocation, that's my life, that's what I live for. But when I now get behind the wheel of the car and I check my mirrors and I look around and I start it up and I realize I am driving, I've never had a stronger sense of satisfaction and accomplishment in my life.
Yeah. You mentioned your mother, and you talked about how you learned to bake bread with her. I mean, all the stories in this book, you have a kind of mentor, instructor, someone who helps you throughout, whether it's the art instructor or the driving instructor, or indeed your family and your mother, particularly when it came to learning how to bake bread. She was a fantastic baker, wasn't she?
Yes, my mother is a fascinating woman. With whom I've had, like all kids, many a conflict, but in retrospect, I owe her infinitely more than I don't. She was a scientist, a logician, a linguist, but she loved to bake, and she could bake anything. And I just grew up in a house where there were always croissants fresh from the oven, or a cinnamon babka, or an apple tart, or a souffle, or whatever it was. And in the way of kids, I just took it for granted. That's what moms do. They teach all day at the university and they come home and bake. But I decided as I got older, I wanted to go and spend time with her just baking together. Mm. And it was partly because I wanted to learn to bake, which turned out to be a very good thing during the pandemic, I might add, when everyone then caught up with baking. But it was also because I wanted to reconnect with my mother. As I say in the book, my first experience of the power of mastery was being a little kid under the table in a housing project in Philadelphia while my mother rolled out strudel dough and could roll it out incredibly fine. And my sister, and I have 5 sisters, but one particularly, and I would look up from under the table and see the eaves of dough falling over the edge of the table, paper thin. I thought, oh my God, this woman is unbelievably skilled. How do you do that? And I've still felt that way. So I wanted to reconnect with her over a hot oven and feel that we were connected in that way. And it was successful. One of the moving things about it is, she's kept the same mother, what's called a mother in baking, which is the sourdough starter. I don't know if you say sourdough in Britain in the same way, but that's what the sourdough starter. And they turn out to be eternal. Another weird data, I looked into the history of sourdough, and you can still detect through DNA analysis what we call the schmutz, the dirt, the on the baker's hand 200 years ago that entered the sourdough starter and is still there. And it's a small form of immortality, but I find it a very moving one. So I watch my parents age as I age, and I watch my parents age, to think both metaphorically that there's continuity in the sourdough starter, and actually it really is. It goes on being enlivened by the tiny little bugs that linger on our hands. That's where the flavor comes from. That's where the flavor comes from in my mother's bread. I found that moving and transformative.
I love that description of the schmutz, and the way you said that it's a safer guarantee of eternity than all the marble monuments in the world. I thought it was a lovely way of illustrating that.
Oh, I'm glad you like that. That was a particularly intense chapter for me. My like everyone, my parents are fine. I'm going off to see them on Monday, but they're aging, and things that they were virtuosic about even 20 years ago become more difficult as time goes on. And so that was an elegiac moment for my mom.
Yeah. You talked earlier about boxing, which I've never boxed, and I don't particularly want to box myself. But I did see the great value you found in that, in terms of not just boxing itself, but how you build up mastery, bit by bit by bit.
Yes, of all the things I did, the thing I enjoyed most was certainly boxing, and I still love it. And I was boxing yesterday with my great teacher, Joey Contrada, who, as I say in the book, has this ability to look astounded at everything that happens in life. And at first I thought he was astounded that someone as unskilled as I was trying to box, but it's actually, he's just has an appetite for life and reacts, is a beautifully reactive guy. And yes, the thing that fascinated me about boxing, which could not have been more remote from my normal orbit of the world, is again, the simple but profound truth that you build it up out of little steps, right? And you learn jab, jab, cross, hook, slip, uppercut. And the sequence, when you watch a great boxer, Alexis Arguello has become my hero. You can watch him on YouTube. When you watch a great boxer, it just looks like they're throwing punches. Not a bit of it. It's as intricate and pre-planned a formula as any you'll find in physics. That fascinated me. The other thing that fascinated me, and that is, again, as a continuity in the book and in everything that I learned, that is the mystery of mastery, in a sense, the ultimate mystery of mastery, is that obviously I'm not fighting anybody. I'm never going to actually have a fight. I'm just learning this in the abstract. But the only way you can learn it is to imagine an opponent, is to imagine another in the philosophical sense, and capital O, an other, someone who is, because just throwing punches is meaningless. You're constantly trying to imagine what's your opponent, your invisible phantom opponent. What's he trying to do? How do you get the edge on him? How do you get the advantage on him? How do you step to do it? How do you slip to do it? How do you feint to do it? How do you fake the punches? And only by imagining that other can you box at all, can you fight at all. And I think that that's a profound truth. Coming back to magic, which was in some ways the way that I got started watching magicians work. Magicians will tell you that what makes a great magician isn't technical virtuosity, which you could have in a kind of autistic way. It's being engaged with other minds. It's being one step ahead of what you're anticipating. You think, I know I know what he's going to do next, and he does something else that astounds you in another way. And that openness to other minds is the ultimate lesson I learned about mastery, that we cannot escape the other. There's a great French philosopher named Levinas who said once, I know that I am because I see myself in the eyes of another. And that sounds very French and kind of metaphysical, but it's profoundly true about mastery. Everything we do, dancing, boxing, drawing, drawing is designed to be seen by another eye who will reinterpret the things we've drawn, will project into it as well. That everything we do engages some other, sometimes many others. If you're, in my work as a writer, I've got an audience. In my work as a boxer, I have an invisible opponent. But there is always an other in the work we do, in the real work. It defines the real work.
Now, when you wrote about boxing, you connected that to dancing, learning to dance. And this is another wonderful family moment, isn't it? Where you learned to dance with your daughter.
My wonderful daughter, who was gone off to university, had gone through changes, emotional and social changes, come out as gay. Yeah. But I wanted to reconnect with her. We resemble each other in many ways. And I didn't want her to have to do the work with me that I had done with my mother belatedly, of trying to connect over a shared craft. So we took dancing lessons together. We still are taking them together. It's exactly, and then the last chapter, I tried to suggest or show that the sequence of aggressive moves you make in boxing precisely mimic the set of congenial, of diplomatic, annealing moves we make in dancing to an uncanny degree. It's the same business of short, specific steps turning into a seemingly seamless sequence. And it was also my way of connecting with my wonderful daughter, Olivia, and over a shared activity. And she was very funny about it, because she said at one point, Dad, this is the most gendered thing I've ever done, because in dancing, the man leads and the woman follows. But she didn't want to change it. She recognized that we were stepping inside a tradition that could support us, even if we didn't take it entirely seriously. So yes, the last chapter is all about simultaneously boxing with my grandfather, my now long gone grandfather, who loved boxing, and dancing with my daughter as a preparation for her escape into adult life.
And you quote in the book that, well, you tell the story about Ginger Rogers, whose greatest accomplishment was to do everything Fred Astaire did, but do it backwards, as she said.
In heels, doing backwards
in heels. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I saw a documentary on her recently, and it wasn't just doing it backwards in heels, but the number of times that she had to do it. her feet would bleed. It was just exhausting and damaging to her feet and so on.
Astaire was everyone says, I knew one person who knew him well, was the hardest taskmaster, the greatest perfectionist. Everything looks, Astaire is the ultimate instance of that kind of mastery, right? Because it was brutal steps that you had to master. And when we watch it, we see nothing but the most fluid lyrical sequence imaginable. But just to add, lots of people could dance as well as Fred Astaire. What makes Fred Astaire so extraordinary is the attitude he brought to it, the attitude of absolute sprezzatura, right? Dancing is as natural. You never spot the effort. And that's part of the greatness. That is the greatness.
One of the areas of mastery was about defeating your own phobias, the monster in you. You suffer from shy bladder syndrome.
Perioresis, yes.
Which sounds, not very serious, but it's incredibly debilitating, isn't it? It's
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. That chapter, as you can imagine, was the hardest one for me to write, and the one where I was saying, "Do I want to publish this?" I recalled, that Mike Nichols, the great director, once said, in my presence, as it happened, that in everything you do in life, whether it's a book or a movie or a play, there should be one thing where everybody involved says, "Can we really do this? Are we doing this?" And I felt that way. I suffer from, have my whole life from perioresis, which is extreme shy bladder syndrome. I can't or couldn't urinate in any public place. And it was particularly brutal on airplanes where you're stuck for 7 or 8 hours at a time. It's not idiosyncratic. It turns out to be. I finally saw therapy with the president of the International Perioresis Association, or he became that as we were working together, not because he was working with me, but he did. And it's a very frequent phobia, which brings a lot of shame to it because it's so kind of personal and schmutzy in another way. And exactly what fascinated me about it, it was sort of a form of anti-mastery that required the same kind of effort, right? I was trying to disassemble this monstrous dungeon that I'd gotten myself locked up in, as we all do, right? It can be fear of flying or an eating disorder or medical anxiety. Almost, one of the things my wonderful therapist, Dan Rocker, said to me is, you got to understand everybody's got something. Everybody's fighting something. No matter how accomplished they look or how smooth they look, they're fighting with something. And that's just true. And so what I learned in the course of trying to rid myself, which I've done somewhat, though far from perfectly, of this is it's the same system, only put in reverse, right? The way you learn how to, if you'll allow me, pee in a public place is to go to public places and try and pee. And it's frustrating at first, and then you get better at it, and then you practice more, and it becomes, and there's no substitute for it. You're disassembling a phobia in exactly the same way you assemble an accomplishment. And that was terribly moving and thrilling for me. And once again, it was also about connection. All of these things are about connection. I felt deeply connected to men whose histories are totally unlike my own and not from different classes, different kinds. And yet we all shared this particular embarrassing but human suffering. And so for me, in a sense, that was the hardest chapter to write, and in a certain sense, the one I'm proudest of.
Yeah, I have to say I'm very grateful for your honesty, because I think it's an essential chapter, and it does illuminate a lot of the points you were making, and I'm sure will be very helpful. Another thing that I got from that chapter, but also the chapter on driving, was how you got around the city, the method you used. You talked in the book about you cycling a lot around New York, and how you came to know the city you enjoy most even better. And one of our areas of work is about the future of cities and why people like being in cities, why they enjoy cities. And it's a byproduct of your book, I guess. But I took a lot from this about how you engaged with the city during that mastering driving and your own overcoming your own demons, as it were.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful to hear. It wasn't, we're talking about, conscious themes and sub themes that I'm alert to. I hadn't thought about that one, honestly, but of course it would be there because I am the ultimate city boy that you could find. It's the one source of friction in my 40-year marriage is that my wife would love to have a place in the country and a garden. And like Woody Allen, nature and I are too. I just don't get it, what the excitement is about being in a green, among green grass when you can be on hard asphalt, sharing a pavement with a million other people. And New York is my home and my favorite place, but I love it equally in London. And of course, Paris is a city close to my heart where I spend a lot of time. And yes, I have written about urbanism endlessly in my life. At some point, I'll publish a collected essays, and there'll be a whole section just about cities and their meanings. And one of the things that makes cities so extraordinary is exactly what we're talking about in the context of the Turk. They are citadels of mastery. Everywhere you go, there are people who are ridiculously good at things. You take your kid to a dance studio, and the teacher who's teaching 6-year-olds is a better dancer than anyone you've seen. New York is a particularly poignant citadel of mastery in that way, because so many people come here as pilgrims, make their way partially, and then become teachers or secondary participants in it. And yes, I believe that that's what makes cities so irreplaceable. And it's one of the things I think that worries all of us, even, post-pandemic in the age of what we're doing right now, Zooming, can we keep that kind of essential density of cities intact? And how do we do it without pricing working people out of it? When I arrived in New York, it was possible to get a tiny basement room on the Upper East Side at a price that, a couple of graduate students could afford. That gets harder and harder with every year. How we protect the vitality of cities, which depends on plurality, on a principle of plurality, not diversity necessarily, good as diversity is, but plurality, many, many kinds coming together and living together. There's nothing I think about more, and nothing that I would be happier than to feel that that's embodied, or perhaps I should say embedded in this book.
Well, please do bring those essays together, because we've used them extensively in our work.
Oh, that's right.
And indeed your books about Paris as well. And just indulge me for a moment, because when I was reading this book, I kept a list of all the things that I wanted to do in the rest of my life, accomplish. So, I want to learn Greek, and I want to learn about the classics and ancient Rome. I want to learn German. I want to take one really good photograph in my life. I want to be able to paint. I want to write an essay like Adam Gopnik, and I've always regretted not reading English literature at school. And I was very inspired by a book by your fellow New Yorker, David Denby, when he wrote about great books, My Adventures with Homer, Rousseau, Woolf, and other indestructible writers of the canon. And one aim I've got is to follow that book and read all those books, which I've never read in my life, actually. So, and I'm not getting any younger to do these things. What's your advice to people? Would you just say, get on with it, just do it?
Two pieces of advice. One is you can do it. One is an injection of affirmation. If I could learn to draw, however badly, if I could understand what the task of drawing was, anyone can do it. If I could learn to drive, you can learn to speak Greek. I promise you. The other thing I'd say is, and it's thematic in the book, right, is find a teacher. Find a teacher. The interchange between teacher and student is the drama of this book. Mm-hmm. And there are so many great teachers in the world. And becoming a student again is one of the most invigorating things we can possibly do, because it literally makes us young. It literally makes us young again, because we're once again in a position of openness to instruction. Mm-hmm. Only in this case, to instruction we've chosen rather than some schoolmaster who we haven't. So I would say seek out a great teacher, and we've never been in better circumstances to do it with the internet, to seek and so on. My two remaining ambitions, or among my two remaining ambitions, are to learn Italian, because I love being in Italy, and I always feel deeply ashamed that I speak French reasonably well, that I can't, and I always end up speaking French with an Italian accent, which humiliates my kids. Or I make a famous family story where we were at a restaurant in Venice, and I wanted those beautiful tiny little strawberries, which I think are called fragolini, and instead I ordered fagolini, which are green beans, for dessert. And the waiter brought me green beans, and the kids still think it was the funniest single thing that's happened. So I would love to learn Italian, and I would love to learn to sing. That was actually something I was working on for the purposes of this book. My nights and weekends are spent as a musical theater librettist, and it's crippling not to be able to sing your own songs. And everybody who can sing tells me singing is just speaking in pitch. That's one more thing to master. So that's something else that's very much on my agenda.
I mean, in the book, one of your the fifth mystery of the fifth mystery of mastery is about late style and people who do
Yes.
things late. And this isn't just but this isn't just for those of us who are, approaching retirement or as your daughter, the example of your daughter is, you can do this at any age, can't you?
Totally. And I think it's part of it's why we do seek things out at any age. It was astonishing to me that Olivia, who's about the busiest person I know at university. She's the president of this and the treasurer of that and has that very rich kind of life. Immediately jumped at the chance to take dance lessons. A, she wanted to learn how to dance. It was a valuable skill. And B, she wanted to dance with her dad. She thought that would be, as she understood the psychological mechanics of learning to dance with your dad, what that would mean. And so I think at any point in life, and I genuinely and profoundly believe if you looked over here, you'd see I have my 6 guitars. Playing jazz guitar is my passion. Mm-hmm. I've played on stage, not adeptly, not particularly well, but I've gotten good enough to play. And everything I'm able to do as a writer, I am, and I'll say this unashamedly at the age of 66, I'm a very prolific writer. Yeah. But the reason I'm a prolific writer is because I learned the discipline of playing guitar. I learned that difficult things are doable if you simply persevere. Mm-hmm. If you treat writing, as I always tell my assistants and apprentices, if you treat it as a physical task, you're going to stay on your keyboard the way you would stay on a stationary bike, you will defeat its difficulties invariably. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so in that way, the seemingly secondary accomplishments, God forbid this word, the hobbies we take up are absolutely vital to our inner sense of possibility. And that's true at any age we attempt them.
And another lesson I learned from this is perfect is the enemy of the good. You don't have to be aspire to perfection. You can accomplish a lot in other ways.
Not only do you not have to aspire to perfection, but one of the secrets of the greatest masters is that they welcome and accept imperfection. I have a quick instance of it. There was a great magician named Chan Kanasta who used to perform on the BBC all the time. You can find his old black and white things on YouTube now, so you can find anything. And I was talking to a great magician, Aussie Wind, here. And he said, that's my favorite magician. And I never could understand how he did the things he did. And then I found out he was just doing them. He was taking insane risks, right? He didn't have perfect technique. He was just taking insane risks, but the rewards were so great that the risks were worth it. And I think that's generally true. The great masters are the ones who are not afraid of imperfection in performance. That's different from embracing imperfection is different from not persevering in the craft. You persevere, but you embrace imperfection at the same time. And it's in that balance, that tension between the two things, welcoming accident and working astonishingly hard, that art resides.
You've written about Buster Keaton in the New Yorker, and he's always struck me as someone who was both a great achiever and accomplished so much in terms of the art of movie making, the art of being an actor, the art of making a stunt look easy, and so on. Would you say he's both them, or?
Well, yes. I mean, I adore Keaton as I do Chaplin, and I was so pleased to be able to write about him at length, because when you study the great sequences like the storm sequence in Steamboat Bill, and you're just astounded by the perfection of form. It's like the greatest kind of ballet, and it's funny at the same time. And the house, he's standing against the house that then falls down directly on over his head, and you find out that was not a stunt. He just knew how to stand there, and while the house fell on him. But the greatness of it at the same time is it comes so deep inside Keaton's own psychology. He was horribly abused by his father. And so much of the stoicism that he makes into comedy is the stoicism of a profound wound, right? Of being beaten by your father on stage and learning to take it. Once again, that you can't separate out the impeccable technical perfection of his comedy from the deep wound that motivated his comedy. And it's the totality of Keaton as a human being in all of his tragedy at very, very unhappy later years, and all of his tragedy and all of his talent that inspires us. If he were simply doing those things, if he were a robot making exactly the same steps in exactly the same way, it would fail to engage us at all. It's Keaton who masters us and Buster who moves us.
Yeah. Just a couple of other things from the book. Like you, I'm a great admirer, influenced by Camus. and he's done the same for you, hasn't he? And I think that underpins some of the things in the book, doesn't it?
I have many intellectual heroes. I'm a natural hero worshiper, heroine worshiper too, for good or ill. But if I have one preeminent one, it would be Camus. Partly because of the reasons that I talked about in my previous book, A Thousand Small Sanities, about liberalism. You know, the great task of 20th century liberals in our sense, not in a party sense, but in a philosophical sense, was to be equally hard on the authoritarian horrors of the right and on the totalitarian temptations of the left. And very few people were able eloquently to navigate that without falling over to the temptation of one side or another. Orwell in England did, and Camus even more eloquently and beautifully, because the temptations were greater in lots of ways during the occupation and afterwards, did it most movingly. And he did it because he posited a whole philosophy on the power of individual action, on the way in which, and it's the philosophical underpinning of this book, is on the way in which taking a leap is essential, is what defines us as human. I tell the story in the book about when Luke was working, my son was working as an apprentice for David Blaine, and David Blaine was doing the bullet catch, and he was actually doing a real bullet catch. They're firing a bullet at him, and Luke explained to me how it was done, low velocity rifle, laser guide. And I said, so what's the trick to the bullet catch? And he said to me, Dad, the trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet, meaning that at some point you had to stand there with your mouth open while they fired a bullet into you. That sums up Camus' philosophy in a phrase. The trick to the bullet catch is catching the bullet. And sooner or later, we all have to step up and catch our own particular bullet. That's where Camus and David Blaine and magic and the real work all come together for me.
And the final question I just had for you, it's more of a comment really, but in the boxing section, you talk about the writer Bud Schulberg. And like you, I think he's one of the most underrated writers.
Oh, fantastic. Yes.
I constantly push his books onto people, not just, on the waterfront and so on, but the wonderful book about Scott Fitzgerald and the remarkable What Makes Sammy Run. I've given those books away to so many people in my time. And if there's one thing I want to accomplish, it's to try and get him up people's attention a bit more, really.
That is astounding, but it's exactly, of course, part of the mystery of mastery, right? Is that you discover whenever you fall in love with a writer or a musician or something, there's a world of enthusiasts. I couldn't agree more about Schulberg. The Disenchanted, his novel it's an autobiographical novel about working with Fitzgerald. It's one of the most moving books in American literature, and beautifully written, just wonderfully written, deeply moving and understanding of Fitzgerald's time. I couldn't agree with you more. I'm just reading now Schulberg's memoir, which I did not read before, Hollywood Prince, it's called, and a wonderful writer. I sit, for my shame, on the board of Library of America, which is sort of the American Pleiad, and one of my projects is to get Schulberg back in print. They indulge me on certain number of projects, and I think that that would be a good one. But once again, not to be drumming my book too hard here, but exactly the point is Schulberg is a master, right? But he's a master of the seemingly second rank, a minor master, and yet he gives us this extraordinary amount. And as we praise Philip Roth and John Updike, we need a place for Bud Schulberg as well, and that's one of the themes of this book.
We're a kindred spirit, Adam, because I didn't read out the bit when I said one of my aims was, one of my accomplishments, what I'd hope to accomplish is to get Bud Schulberg better known. And there's a sentence underneath my notes which says, and get a complete works in the Library of America. So,
oh my goodness, yes. Well, I'm working.
If for what it's worth, if you need a letter of support, and if say there's a bridge you'll buy a copy, I'll order it.
Well, in all seriousness, that his reputation is not just narrowly American or narrowly New York or narrowly Hollywood is, I think, an important part of it. It's a source of it should be a source of enormous encouragement for all of us who write that things revolve in the great ocean of appreciation. And now, for instance, Library of America has done noir fiction, books, novels by writers who were literally forgotten the day they died, never had an obituary, wrote what were thought of as pulp novels, but have such an enormous effect on American consciousness through the noir novels that they're right there alongside William Dean Howells and Herman Melville and the rest. So, the wheels of history grind very fine in the end, and let's hope they grind some flour for Bud Schulberg.
So why try and accomplish more? You talk about Mary Oliver in your book, and you ask her a question she asks in The Summer Day. Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And I think looking for accomplishment, personal accomplishment, is one answer to that, isn't it?
Yes, it brings a tear to my eye when you read that, because it's such a beautiful and fundamental thing. I think looking for personal accomplishment is part of it. At an even deeper level, in a sense, Andrew, I'd say, in my experience at least, happiness is absorption. The moments in our life when we genuinely feel happy, not exalted or satisfied or satiated, when we genuinely feel happy, is when we're at maximum absorption. And when we're, there's a beautiful line somewhere in Larkin about the vigilant paying of attention. I'm butchering Larkin's line, but we all know that feeling. And what all of these, comic essays in struggling to learn something in middle age are about is finally finding that moment of the flow, that moment of absorption, and saying, this makes me happy. This is the meaning of life in no modest sense. This is the meaning of life. It's those moments of absorption and flow. It can be absorption in child rearing. It can be absorption in learning to drive. But those are the moments that we seek out in life that are authentic happiness that no one can take away from us.
Well, thank you, Adam Gopnik, for joining us today. The real work is out now from River Run. Do read the book. It's one to savor, learn from, be inspired by. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Andrew, I couldn't have enjoyed this more. This is publication day, and it was a joy to speak with you.
Thank you very much.